"She came here with nothing," Matthew Blackwell said, his voice cracking like dry timber in a summer fire, "and she gave this house everything it was missing." His daughter Clara stood across from him in the kitchen doorway, her face white as bone, her hands balled into tight fists at her sides. The lantern light threw long shadows across the scar that ran from Matthew's left temple to the corner of his jaw, that terrible reminder of a night 5 years ago that had taken everything from him. Clara's eyes were red. She had been crying before she came downstairs, and she was barely holding herself together now, and the silence between them was not the comfortable kind that had always lived in this house. This silence had teeth. "You are not serious," Clara whispered. "Papa, you cannot be serious." "I am more serious than I have ever been about anything in my life. She has been here 4 months. Clara pressed her hand flat against the doorframe as if she needed something solid to hold on to. "4 months, and you are standing in this kitchen talking about her like she is the answer to every prayer this family ever said. You do not even know her. Not really. You do not know what she is hiding. You do not know why she came here with nothing. You do not know what she left behind." Matthew turned toward the window. Outside, the New Mexico Territory night was absolute and vast, the stars burning hard and indifferent above the dark silhouette of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The year was 1882, and this land had teeth too, and Matthew Blackwell knew that better than most men still breathing. "I know what I see," he said quietly. "What you see," Clara said, and the edge in her voice was raw grief more than anger, "is a woman who walked into this house and made herself indispensable in the space of a single season. Have you ever asked yourself why? Have you ever wondered what the hidden motive is? Why a woman like Grace Donnelly would come to a place like this with nothing but a carpet bag and a reference letter, and a willingness to cook and clean and mend and tend and smile at a broken-down rancher with a scar on his face and trouble on every side?" Matthew turned back to look at his daughter. She was 22 years old, the same dark eyes as her mother, the same stubborn set to her jaw. He loved her more than his own life. He also knew when she was afraid. "Is that what you think this is?" he asked. "I think it could be a trap," Clara said. "I think she might be something other than what she claims. And I think you are so lonely that you cannot see it." The words landed like a physical blow. Matthew did not flinch. He stood there in the lamplight, in the kitchen that smelled like fresh bread and dried lavender and the faint traces of wood smoke, and he thought about Grace Donnelly. He thought about the first morning she had arrived, the way she had stood in the yard with her one bag and looked at the Blackwell ranch like it was something she had dreamed about before she ever knew it existed. He thought about everything that had happened since, and he knew he owed Clara the whole truth, even the parts that were going to be hard to say out loud. "Sit down," he said gently. "Let me tell you everything from the beginning." It had started with a letter, not his letter. Matthew Blackwell had not written any letter, had not placed any advertisement, had not sent any word to any city or town that he was in need of help. He had been managing the ranch the way he had managed everything since his wife Alina died in the spring of 1877, which was to say badly, stubbornly, and with a pride that was slowly grinding him down to nothing. He had a foreman named Hector Ruiz who kept the cattle end of things from completely collapsing, and he had young Billy Marsh who helped with the horses, and he had Clara, who kept the house and cooked and cleaned and worried about him constantly, which was not how a 22-year-old woman ought to be spending her days in 1882, not when she had her own life to be living. The letter had come to his neighbor, a widow named Margaret Forsyth, who ran a small boarding house in the town of Cuesta Verde, 12 miles south of the Blackwell Ranch. Margaret had been the one who wrote the advertisement, not to any big Eastern newspaper, but to a church organization in St. Louis that helped women of reduced circumstances find respectable situations in the Western Territories. Margaret had needed a cook. What arrived instead on the afternoon stage from Santa Fe on the 3rd day of March was Grace Donnelly. Matthew had been in town that day, which was the day everything changed, though he had not known it yet. He had ridden into Cuesta Verde to settle a dispute with a man named Harlan Cole, who claimed that Matthew's fence line had been moved west by a quarter-mile, which was a lie, but the kind of lie that required a lawyer or a fistfight to resolve, and Matthew was tired of both. He was standing outside the land office when the afternoon stage pulled in, and he had watched without particular interest as the passengers climbed down into the dust. There were 3 of them, a drummer with a sample case, an old man in a black coat who was apparently a circuit preacher, and Grace Donnelly. She was not what he had expected. He had not been expecting anything, but if he had tried to imagine a woman answering a domestic advertisement for a boarding house in a small New Mexico Territory town, he might have imagined someone tired-looking, middle-aged, defeated by whatever circumstances had brought her west. What stepped down from that stage instead was a woman of perhaps 28 years, slender and straight-backed, with dark red hair pinned up under a plain straw hat that had seen better days, wearing a traveling dress of dark blue wool that was clean but visibly mended at both cuffs. She carried one carpet bag. She looked at Cuesta Verde with calm gray eyes, and she did not look defeated at all. She looked like someone who had already survived the worst thing that was ever going to happen to her and had decided, quietly and without drama, to get on with living. Matthew had looked away. He had his own problems, but fate, or something that wore fate's clothing, had a different idea. Margaret Forsythe came rushing out of her boarding house across the street in a state of barely contained distress, met Grace on the sidewalk, and the conversation that followed was short and dismaying. Matthew could not hear it, but he saw Margaret's apologetic gestures, saw the woman's face go carefully, precisely still, saw her nod once with a composure that struck him as extraordinary. Later, from Margaret herself, he learned what had been said. The cook position was gone. Margaret's niece had arrived from Albuquerque unexpectedly, intending to stay indefinitely and help with the boarding house, and Margaret, flustered and guilty, had explained that there was simply no room and no position. She had offered to put Grace up for one night at no charge and to help her find the next stage back to Santa Fe, and that was the best she could do, and she was terribly sorry. What Grace Donnelly had said, according to Margaret, was this: "Please do not apologize. These things happen. Is there anywhere else in the area that might need help?" Matthew had not gone over. He had conducted his business at the land office and gone to the general store and purchased flour and coffee and a box of cartridges for his Winchester, and he had been untying his horse from the rail outside the saloon, preparing to head home, when he heard the raised voices. It was Harlan Cole and 2 of his ranch hands. They had cornered Grace Donnelly at the alley entrance beside the saloon, not physically threatening her, but Cole was drunk enough to be ugly about it, making remarks of the kind that men like him made when they thought a woman was alone and vulnerable. He was a big man, red-faced and mean, and his 2 hands were laughing, and Grace was standing with her back against the wall holding her carpet bag in front of her like a shield, her face absolutely white but her eyes utterly fearless. Matthew crossed the street in 4 strides. "Cole," he said. The man turned. Cole and Matthew had a history, and none of it was good, and Cole's face went from drunk amusement to something uglier and harder in the space of a breath. "Blackwell," Cole said. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me," Matthew said, in the voice he used when he meant every single word, "when a man acts like a coward in the street." Cole's jaw tightened. He was drunk enough to want trouble and just sober enough to know that Matthew Blackwell was not the man to have it with. Cole had 20 years on him, was thicker through the chest, but Matthew had something in his eyes that most men eventually decided not to test. The scar did not hurt either in terms of discouraging people. Cole muttered something filthy and moved on, taking his men with him. Matthew turned to the woman. Up close, her eyes were not gray. They were green with gray in them, like river water over slate. She was looking at him with a directness that he found surprising. "Thank you," she said. "No theatrics, no trembling, just those 2 clean words. Are you all right?" He asked. "I am fine," she said. "I have dealt with worse than that." He believed her. He did not know why he believed her, but he did. He believed her entirely. They stood there for a moment in the March afternoon, the wind coming off the mountains carrying the faint smell of pine and cold stone, and he said, before he had fully decided to say it, "My ranch is 12 miles north. I need a housekeeper. It is not a grand position. The house is in poor shape. There is a young woman, my daughter, who runs things as best she can, but it is too much for one person. The pay is fair. You would have your own room." Grace Donnelly looked at him steadily. "Why are you offering me this?" "Because you need a position and I need help," he said. "Those are the only reasons." She studied him for another moment, this scarred, weathered man who had just stepped in front of Harlan Cole without hesitating, and something in her expression made the faintest shift, like a curtain moved by a breeze so slight you were not sure you had seen it at all. "All right," she said. "I accept." He had not even told her his name yet. The road north to the Blackwell ranch was 12 miles of red dirt between juniper and pinon, with the mountains rising on the eastern horizon, and the sky so enormous overhead it felt like a physical weight. They made the journey in Matthew's wagon, and neither of them said much, which should have been awkward but was not. Grace sat on the board seat beside him with her carpet bag on her lap, watching the landscape with those green-gray eyes, and Matthew drove and did not look at her more than was necessary, which was already more than he had intended. "You are Matthew Blackwell," she said, after about 3 miles. "Yes. I have heard the name. In Santa Fe, before I took the stage to Cuesta Verde. People said you were a fair man and an honest rancher." "People are generous," he said. "People are usually accurate," she said, "about the things that matter." He did not respond to that. But something in him, some tight and defended thing, moved infinitesimally, like a door that has been closed for years, shifting a fraction of an inch in its frame. Clara's reaction to Grace's arrival had been complicated from the very first. She was standing in the yard when the wagon came up the track, and her face went through several things very quickly: surprise and wariness, and something that might have been relief before she got control of it. Clara had been managing the Blackwell house for 3 years, since she was 19, and she was exhausted in a way she had never said out loud, because saying it would have felt like a betrayal of her father and a failure of her own pride. Matthew introduced them. Clara was polite in the careful way of someone who has not yet decided what to feel. Grace was simply herself, which was calm and direct and free of any obvious attempt to charm or impress. "I will need someone to show me the house," Grace said to Clara, "and I would rather know what actually needs doing than be told what I am expected to say thank you for. I hope that is all right." Clara blinked. Then something that was almost a smile crossed her face, the first genuine one Matthew had seen from her in months. "All right," Clara said. "Come inside." The Blackwell house had 4 rooms on the ground floor and 2 above, built in 1869 when Matthew had first come to this land with Alina and young Clara, and a dream that was larger than his resources, but just barely not larger than his determination. Alina had made it beautiful once, with curtains and a garden and small domestic touches that turned a raw plank structure into something warm. After Alina died, the beauty had faded. Not because Matthew did not care, but because he was broken in a way that was hard to name, and the house had broken with him. The curtains had frayed and not been replaced. The garden had gone to weeds. The kitchen was functional but grim. The sitting room held furniture that had not been rearranged since Alina placed it. Grace walked through all of it with Clara, and she did not say what a shame or what a pity or any of the things that would have felt like judgment. She said things like, "This floor is it pine. Pine can be sanded back beautifully, and those windows face west, so there is afternoon light. We could use that." Clara, listening, felt the first uncurling of something she had not realized was coiled tight inside her. By the end of that first week, the sitting room had been rearranged. Not dramatically, not in a way that erased Alina's choices, but in a way that breathed air back into the space. The kitchen, scrubbed to its bones, smelled like something other than old grease and dust. Grace had found seeds in a tin at the back of the pantry, Alina's seeds, still labeled in Alina's handwriting, and she had asked Matthew if she might plant them in the yard beside the kitchen door. Matthew had stood there holding that tin, looking at Aline's handwriting, and he had not spoken for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally, "plant them." That was the first crack. Grace was not without her secrets. Matthew understood this. He was a man who had spent enough years watching other people to know the difference between privacy and concealment, and Grace had both. She did not talk about where she came from except in the broadest strokes. She had grown up in St. Louis, she had worked as a teacher's assistant, she had come west. The gaps in that story were apparent, and she did not try to fill them in, which was itself a kind of information. She had not come west on a whim. Something had driven her here, something she was not yet ready to name. He did not press. He told himself he did not press because it was not his business. The truth was slightly more complicated than that. The routine of the ranch settled around Grace Donnelly like it had been waiting for her. She rose before dawn and had coffee ready when Matthew came in from the early check of the stock, which was his habit every morning at 5:30 regardless of the weather. The first morning she handed him a cup without being asked, and he took it without comment, but something shifted in the air between them that was small and important, and neither of them acknowledged it. She and Clara worked together with a rapport that developed quickly into genuine warmth. Clara was not an easy young woman to get close to. She had her father's guardedness and her mother's fierce pride. But Grace had a gift for meeting people exactly where they were without trying to move them anywhere else. She did not push Clara to talk, but she was always there when Clara was ready. And Clara, who had been carrying loneliness like a stone for years, found herself talking more than she had expected to. Clara told Grace about Aline, about the illness that had come fast and cruel in the winter of 1877 and taken her before any of them had truly understood they were losing her. About how Matthew had changed afterward, how the warmth had not left him exactly but had gone somewhere interior, somewhere deep and defended, and how the scar on his face, which he had gotten in the winter of 1878 during a fight with men who had tried to steal his cattle, seemed almost like a physical manifestation of what had happened to him inside. "He was not always like this," Clara said one afternoon while they were hanging laundry on the line behind the house, the April wind lifting the sheets into white billowing shapes. "Before Mama died, he laughed. He told stories. He danced with her in the kitchen on Sunday evenings when he thought no one was watching." She paused. "I was always watching." Grace was quiet for a moment, pinning a shirt to the line with steady hands. "That kind of grief does not go away," she said, "but it can change shape, given time and reason." Clara glanced at her sideways. "What drove you here, Grace? And I mean the real answer, not the one you give when people are not listening properly." The silence that followed was the longest Grace had yet allowed, and Clara almost thought she had pushed too hard. But then Grace said quietly, "I was engaged to a man in St. Louis. His name was Robert Alderton. He was a lawyer. He was from a good family and everyone approved of the match, and I tried to convince myself that approval was the same as rightness." She smoothed a wrinkle from the wet linen with her palm. "It was not. He was a man who needed to own things, including people. I realized it in time, but leaving cost me everything I had built there. My position, my lodgings, my reputation, because he made certain to say things about why I had broken the engagement that were not true but were believed." Clara stared at her. "So you came west," Clara said. "I came west," Grace said, "with what fit in one carpet bag and what was left in my savings, which was not much. And I answered an advertisement for a position in a boarding house in a town I had never heard of." She finally looked at Clara directly, and her green-gray eyes were completely steady. "I did not come here with any hidden motive. I came here because I needed a place. That is the whole truth." Clara held that truth for a long moment, feeling it settle into her like water into dry ground. "I believe you," Clara said, and the last of her guardedness, or most of it, quietly let go. April became May in the New Mexico territory, and the land went through its brief, desperate flowering, the wildflowers blazing along the creek banks and the mountains losing their last snow, and the air warming and smelling of sage and red earth. The Blackwell Ranch, which had been merely functional for years, began to feel like something more. It was a subtle change, the kind that happened in small increments. A window box with something green growing in it, a clean tablecloth at supper, the sound of humming from the kitchen in the early morning. But incremental change accumulates, and one day in May, Matthew came in from a long afternoon in the south pasture repairing fence line and found a fire in the sitting room fireplace and the table set for supper and the smell of something extraordinary coming from the kitchen. And he stood in the doorway of his own house and felt, for a terrifying instant, that he was home. He had not felt that in 5 years. The terror of it was real. He understood it immediately. He went to the pump behind the house and washed his hands and his face in the cold water and stood there in the fading evening light pressing the feeling down, putting it somewhere he could manage it. He could not afford this. He told himself it was gratitude. He told himself it was simple relief, the natural response to having a capable person restore order to a disordered household. He told himself a great many things over the following weeks as May rolled into June, and the heat settled in, and Grace Donnelly continued to be exactly what she was, which was real and present and quietly extraordinary. She was learning the ranch. She asked questions of Hector Ruiz about the cattle operation, not from nosiness but from a genuine desire to understand what the land required. And Hector, who had been quietly skeptical of this Eastern woman, found himself answering her at length, and then wondering when he had started to like her. She asked young Billy Marsh to show her the horses, and she learned all of their names and temperaments within a week, and Billy, who was 19 and shy as a deer, turned brick red whenever she spoke to him and started taking better care of his appearance. Matthew watched all of this from a careful distance. He watched and he told himself he was not watching. The night of the first real confrontation between them came in the middle of June, during a thunderstorm that came off the mountains fast and violent, the kind that rattled the windows and drove the cattle to the far fence and split a piñon down the road in half with a crack like a rifle shot. Matthew had been in the barn securing the horses when the storm broke fully. By the time he got back to the house, he was soaked to the skin, and Grace was in the kitchen doorway holding a lantern, looking out toward the barn with something on her face that was not simply the concern of an employee watching for her employer. She stepped back when she saw him coming. By the time he came through the door, her expression had rearranged itself into something more neutral. "You are drenched," she said. "I will get a towel." "I can get my own towel," he said more sharply than he intended. She stopped, looked at him with those level green eyes. "I know you can," she said calmly. "I was offering to save you the trouble." He stood there dripping on the kitchen floor, feeling the unfairness of his own sharpness, and said, "I apologize, that was rude." "You are wet and cold and the storm scared the horses," she said. "You do not need to apologize for being human." There was a long moment where neither of them spoke. Lightning flashed somewhere nearby and the thunder came 3 seconds later, deep and physical. Grace did not flinch. Matthew, watching her, said without planning to, "Are you afraid of storms?" "No," she said. Then, with a small honesty that cost her something, "I was afraid you were still out there when it broke. The lightning was very close." The kitchen felt suddenly smaller. Matthew could hear the rain hammering the roof and the wind pushing at the walls and something else, something internal and pressing that he had no name for or refused to name. "I am always careful," he said. "I can see that," she said. "It does not stop the worrying." She handed him a towel from the rail by the stove and turned away to tend to something on the stovetop, and he stood there holding the towel and the conversation, both of them warm and unexpected in his hands, and thought that he was in a great deal of trouble. He did not sleep well that night. The dark past came calling at the end of June, and it arrived wearing Harlan Cole's face. Cole had been building toward something for months. He wanted the Blackwell Ranch, or more specifically, he wanted the water rights that came with it, the creek that ran through the eastern edge of Matthew's land being the most reliable water source in a 10-mile radius. He had tried legal pressure. He had tried fence line disputes. He had tried having his men make trouble on Matthew's range when they thought no one was watching. None of it had worked because Matthew Blackwell was the kind of man who did not yield, and that stubbornness, which was sometimes a flaw, was in this context a survival trait. But Cole was patient in the way that mean men often are, and in late June he found what he thought was his opening. He had learned about Grace Donnelly. Not about Grace herself, but about Robert Alderton. Harlan Cole had connections in Santa Fe that Matthew did not know about, and through those connections, he had sent inquiries east. And what came back was the story that Robert Alderton had put into circulation in St. Louis, which was that Grace Donnelly had left her engagement after stealing money from her employer, a matter that had been handled privately to avoid scandal, but which remained a black mark on her character. It was a lie. Matthew would understand later that it was a complete fabrication, built by a man whose pride Grace had wounded by leaving him, who had used his social position and his legal connections to construct a false history that would follow her. But Cole did not know or care whether it was true. He only cared that it was useful. He rode up to the Blackwell ranch on a Wednesday afternoon when he knew, because his men had been watching, that Matthew was in the south pasture. He came with 2 men and a self-satisfied expression, and found Grace in the front yard pulling weeds from the kitchen garden, the real garden now, Alina's seeds having come up in a riot of green and color. Matthew got back 40 minutes later to find Grace standing on the front porch with her arms wrapped around herself, which was the first time he had ever seen her hold herself that way, and Cole's wagon was already disappearing down the track. What happened? Matthew asked, swinging down from his horse. Grace told him. She told him everything, clearly and without flinching, including the accusation Cole had brought and the truth behind it, including Robert Alderton and the lie and why it had been told. She did not cry. She did not perform composure either. She was simply honest in the way she was honest about everything, right down to the bone. Matthew stood on the porch steps listening, and the thing that rose in him as he listened was not doubt. It was fury. Clean and absolute. Not because Cole had tried to use Grace as a weapon against him, though that was there too, but because someone had built a trap of lies around a woman who had done nothing worse than leave a man who deserved to be left, and that trap had followed her 1,000 miles from St. Louis to the red dirt of New Mexico. "Do you believe me?" Grace asked, when she had finished. The question was careful and undefended, and the fact that she needed to ask it told him what those months in St. Louis had cost her. "I believed you the day I met you," he said. Something in her face changed. Not dramatically, not with tears or relief in any obvious form, but something behind her eyes shifted the way deep water shifts when the current changes direction underneath. "Thank you," she said. It was the same 2 words she had said to him that first day in Questa Verde, but they weighed entirely more now. Matthew dealt with Cole through the county sheriff, a practical man named Elias Webb who had known both Matthew and Cole for years and had no illusions about either of them. The slander Cole had spread about Grace was untrue and unprovable, and Webb made that clear to Cole in terms that left no room for comfortable interpretation. Cole backed down, not because he was moved by justice, but because Elias Webb had the kind of authority that made backing down the intelligent choice. But the incident had changed something. Clara knew it. She watched her father in the days after Cole's visit with the particular attention of someone who loves a person and has been waiting for years to see them begin to live again. Matthew was not dramatically different. He was not suddenly warm and easy in the way he had been before Alina died. But there was something less defended in the way he moved through his own house, something less rigid in his expression when Grace came into a room. Clara also knew that Grace was frightened. Not of Cole, not of the lie that had followed her from St. Louis. Grace was frightened of the same thing Matthew was frightened of, which was the feeling that had been building in this house since March like water rising behind a dam, and which neither of them had the courage yet to name. Clara was 22 years old and she was her mother's daughter, which meant she was not without a certain practical streak when it came to the people she loved. She arranged things. It was not complicated. In mid-July, when the heat was at its worst and the ranch needed supplies from town, Clara claimed a headache that she did not entirely have and sent Matthew into Questaverde with Grace, on the grounds that someone needed to go and Clara was not well enough, and the supplies were genuinely needed, and it would take most of the day. Matthew knew exactly what his daughter was doing. He went anyway. The drive into Questaverde with Grace was different from that first journey in March. They were not strangers now. They were two people who had been orbiting each other for 4 months in the close quarters of a working ranch, who knew each other's habits and small preferences and silences. Matthew knew that Grace took her coffee with no sugar and liked it strong enough to stand a spoon in. He knew she hummed when she was happy and went quiet when she was troubled. He knew she had a way of tilting her head slightly to the left when she was thinking hard about something, and that she laughed unexpectedly and with her whole face, and then sometimes looked surprised at herself for laughing. Grace knew that Matthew woke before anyone else and spent the first half-hour of every morning standing in the yard in the dark looking at the mountains, and that this was not insomnia but something more deliberate, some private accounting with the world that he needed to make each day before the work of the day began. She knew he was a fair man in his dealings with Hector and Billy and the other hands, that he never raised his voice in anger, that he carried a grief he had never fully spoken aloud, and that it was not only for Eleanor but for the version of himself that had existed before Eleanor died. She knew the scar bothered him not because of how it looked but because of what it represented, which was a night when he had been afraid. They picked up the supplies from the general store. They had a meal at the small restaurant on the main street, a place run by a Mexican family that served excellent food, and they sat across from each other at a table by the window and ate red chili stew and fresh tortillas and talked. Not about anything urgent. About the ranch, about Clara, about a book Grace had been reading, about the way the mountains changed color in the afternoon light. Ordinary conversation. But the ordinary conversation of two people who were completely at ease with each other, and who were only now noticing what that ease meant. On the drive home, with the sun dropping behind the western plateau and the sky going extraordinary colors above the mountains, Grace said, "Clara faked that headache, did she not?" "Thoroughly," Matthew said. Grace laughed, that whole-face laugh, and then looked surprised at herself. "She is not subtle," Matthew said. "She loves you very much," Grace said. "She does," he agreed. Then, after a pause that had weight in it, "I am glad she did it today." Grace looked at him. The light was amber and long, falling across the wagon seat and the dust of the road in his face, the strong lines of it with the scar, and she looked at him the way she sometimes looked at the mountains when she thought no one was watching, like something that was simultaneously beautiful and daunting. "So am I," she said quietly. He reached across without planning it and took her hand where it rested on the seat between them. Just held it loosely, the way you hold something you are very careful with. She did not pull away. She turned her hand slightly so her fingers rested against his, and they rode the last 6 miles home in the long western evening without saying anything else, and it was the most significant silence Matthew Blackwell had experienced in 5 years. The complications did not wait politely for them to be ready. Robert Alderton arrived in Questaverde in the second week of August. He was not what Matthew had imagined. He had imagined someone who looked like his villainy, some obvious physical manifestation of the trap he had built around Grace. What arrived was a man of 35, handsome in a soft-featured way, well-dressed, carrying himself with the particular confidence of someone who had never had to question whether he belonged somewhere. He had come, he told Elias Webb, to find Grace Donnelly, who was his former betrothed, and who had left St. Louis under circumstances he preferred not to detail but which concerned him greatly, and he was prepared to take her home. Grace did not know he was coming. The first she knew of it was the morning he rode up the Blackwell Ranch track in a hired buggy, and she was in the kitchen garden when she looked up and saw him coming, and the blood left her face so completely that Clara, who was working beside her, reached out and took her arm. "Who is that?" Clara asked. Robert Alderton, Grace said, in a voice like the space after a door slams. Matthew came out of the barn at the sound of the buggy. He saw Grace's face. He looked at the man in the buggy. He understood the situation in the 3 seconds it took to cross the yard. He reached Grace before Alderton climbed down. "You know who this is?" Matthew asked, low and quiet for her alone. "Yes," she said. "Do you want to speak to him?" "No," she said immediately. Then, reconsidering, and because she was Grace, "Yes, I need to. I need to say the things I should have said before I left St. Louis." Matthew nodded. He stood beside her, not in front of her, not between her and Alderton, but beside her, and that distinction was everything. Robert Alderton climbed down from the buggy and looked at Grace with an expression that was intended to be tender but had something else underneath it, something proprietary and aggrieved. "Grace," he said, "I have been so worried. I have come to take you home." "I am home," Grace said. The steadiness in her voice was extraordinary. Alderton's eyes went to Matthew. "And who is this man?" "Matthew Blackwell," Matthew said. "This is my ranch." "Ah," Alderton said, and the tone he used was a small, precise weapon, suggesting something without saying it. "Robert," Grace said, and her voice did not waver, "I left St. Louis because I chose to leave. I left you because continuing was wrong for both of us, though you have never been willing to understand that. The story you told afterward about the money was a lie, and you know it was a lie, and I think some part of you is not entirely comfortable with that." Alderton's face went red. "Grace, I am being clear," she said. "I am being clearer than I was in St. Louis, and I apologize for that because I should have been this clear from the beginning. I do not belong to you. I never did. I belong to myself. I have a life here. I am asking you to go back to St. Louis and to stop spreading lies about me and to leave me in peace." The silence after that was substantial. Robert Alderton looked at Grace, and then at Matthew, and then at Grace again. Something shifted in his face, something that was almost comprehension, almost defeat. "You are certain," he said finally. "I have never been more certain of anything," Grace said. Alderton stood there for another moment. Then he nodded once stiffly. He got back into the buggy. He drove back down the track without another word. The 3 of them stood in the yard watching him go. Clara, who had watched the whole thing from the porch steps, finally released a breath she had apparently been holding for several minutes. Grace stood very still after the buggy disappeared around the first bend. Then she turned to Matthew and said, with a composure that was real but that he could see was costing her, "I am sorry he came here." "Do not apologize for his behavior," Matthew said. "I am not apologizing for him," she said. "I am apologizing because I brought that complication to your door and you did not." She stopped. "Grace," he said. She looked at him. "I would have that man come to my door every day," he said, "if it meant you were still standing in my yard." Clara made a sound from the porch that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Grace's composure cracked then, briefly and beautifully, and she pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment and then took it down again and looked at him with everything she felt visible in her eyes, not hidden, not defended, just there. "Matthew," she said, and his name in her voice was something he needed to hear said that way for the rest of his life. He crossed the remaining space between them and took both her hands in his and said, "I am not good at this. I have not been good at much of anything except work and stubbornness for a long time, but I know what I feel and I know what has changed in this house since March, and I know that I do not want it to stop. If you will, yes," she said before he finished. "I have not asked anything yet," he said. "You were going to ask if I would stay," she said. "Not as the housekeeper, as something else. And the answer is yes." Clara from the porch. "Thank the Lord." The courtship of Matthew Blackwell and Grace Donnelly was, like everything about them, practical and deeply felt and somewhat compressed by circumstance. They were not young people with the luxury of long years of courtship ahead of them. They were 34 and 28 respectively, a man who had lost everything and rebuilt it alone, and a woman who had left everything and started over with nothing. And they had already spent 5 months learning each other in the closest possible quarters. They knew what they were getting. They chose it clearly and without pretense. Matthew asked her properly on the last Sunday of August, in the kitchen garden that had been Alina's seeds and was now Grace's growing things. And she said yes the same way she had said yes to everything with him, completely and without hesitation, and with those green eyes that held nothing back. They were married in October in the church in Cuesta Verde by the circuit preacher who had arrived on the same stage as Grace back in March and who turned out to serve this territory every 6 weeks. It was a small wedding. Clara stood up with Grace. Hector Ruiz stood up with Matthew. Margaret Forsyth came, and Elias Webb, and a scattering of neighboring ranchers who had heard about the Blackwell woman and come to see for themselves what had pulled Matthew out of the 5-year grief that everyone had been quietly worried about. What they saw was Grace Donnelly in a dress of deep green wool that Clara had spent 3 weeks helping her sew, standing beside Matthew Blackwell in his best coat with the scar on his jaw and the mountains behind the church windows, and the way he looked at her was the answer to every question anyone in that room might have had about the nature of what was happening. Grace looked back at him the same way. Elias Webb said afterward to Margaret Forsyth that he had been to a lot of weddings in 30 years in the territory, and he could count on one hand the number where both parties looked like they had found the thing they had always needed and had nearly missed. The winter of 1882 into 1883 settled over the ranch with a quiet that was entirely different from the quiet of the years before. The house was warm, not just in the physical sense, though the stoves were properly maintained now, and there was always wood cut and stacked, but warm in the way that houses are when they are properly inhabited, when people live in them instead of merely surviving in them. Grace learned the rhythms of the cattle operation from Hector, who had given up skepticism entirely and now consulted her routinely on things that were technically outside her purview, because her judgment, it turned out, was reliable and sharp and sometimes caught things he had missed. She learned to ride properly, having been a competent but urban rider before. Matthew taught her on a steady mare named Reseda, and those riding lessons, which took place in the early evenings when the day's work was done and the light was going gold over the western ridge, were some of the happiest hours of both their lives. He would ride beside her and correct her hands on the reins and sometimes reach across and adjust her seat in the saddle, and these casual contacts, so ordinary on the surface, carried a warmth between them that was the natural continuation of every touch and conversation since that first afternoon in March. Matthew was sleeping again. Properly, the way he had not slept since before Alina died. He had not realized how much of himself he had spent on the exhausted vigilance of grief until the grief shifted and there was room for something else. He could not have said precisely when it happened. Only that one morning in December, he woke in the early dark with Grace asleep beside him, and heard the wind against the window and the distant sound of cattle and his own heart beating with something that was not simply the tolling of loss, but also the full sound of a life he was genuinely glad to be living. He lay there for a while and just listened to all of it. Then Grace stirred and turned toward him in her sleep, and he put his arm around her without waking her, and he lay there in the dark of the ranch house in the New Mexico territory on a December morning in 1882, and was, for the first time in many years, entirely at peace. Clara, watching all of this from the comfortable proximity of someone who lives in the same house as two people in love, went through her own transformation. The exhaustion that had been her constant companion for 3 years began to lift. She slept better. She laughed more. She started talking about things she had not let herself talk about before, things she wanted, a life beyond the ranch, not abandoning her father but building something of her own. Grace was the one who helped her see that these were not incompatible, that wanting her own life was not a betrayal of Matthew, that Matthew himself, the real Matthew, the one who had come back to himself over these past months, would be the last person to want his daughter to sacrifice herself. "You have been taking care of everyone else for 3 years," Grace told her one evening in January when they were sitting by the fire and Matthew was outside. "You took care of your father when he was grief-broken. You kept this house. You gave up things you wanted without telling anyone you were giving them up. That is over now, Clara. You can go be yourself." Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and then looked embarrassed about it. "There is a schoolteacher in Cuesta Verde," she said carefully. "Samuel Park. He teaches at the schoolhouse. He is 26 years old and he is originally from Virginia, and he reads every book he can get his hands on, and he has asked me 3 times to take a walk with him after church, and I have said no 3 times because I was not sure I was allowed to have something like that." Grace looked at her steadily. "Say yes next time." Clara did. And that is a story with its own long happiness, but what matters here is that it began. And it began because Grace Donnelly made Clara Blackwell understand that wanting love was not a weakness. Spring returned to the Blackwell ranch, and with it, a different quality of life than the ranch had known in years. The cattle came through the winter in good shape, better than the previous 3 years, in part because of some practical decisions about winter grazing that Grace had suggested to Hector after reading 2 issues of an agricultural journal Matthew had found in his father's books. Hector had implemented the suggestions with some personal skepticism, and then, when they worked, had told everyone it had been his idea, and Grace had let him, because she had no interest in credit and a great deal of interest in Hector being on her side. Harlan Cole had not entirely given up. He was the kind of man who never entirely gave up on what he wanted, but he had been quiet since Elias Webb's conversation with him in July, and what activity his men did on the edges of Matthew's range was not enough to constitute a provocation. Matthew watched him. Cole watched Matthew. They existed in a wary equilibrium that was not friendship and not open war. The real resolution of the Cole problem came in a way no one anticipated. In April of 1883, Cole's own men turned on him. Not dramatically, not with violence, but in the slow, practical way of men who have been cheated and underpaid and pushed too far. 3 of his longest-serving hands came to Elias Webb with detailed accounts of Cole's activities over the past several years, including the fence line fraud and the slander campaign against Grace, and 2 other instances of claim jumping that Webb had not previously been able to prove. Cole was served with legal papers in May. He contested them into the summer and then, in August, settled quietly and departed Cuesta Verde for somewhere else, his ranch eventually purchased at a reduced price by a family from Colorado who were decent neighbors. Matthew told Grace about Cole's departure on a warm August evening, sitting on the front porch of the house with the last light going pink and orange over the mountains. Grace listened and then was quiet for a moment. "Is it wrong that I feel relieved?" she said. "No," Matthew said. "It would be wrong if you were not relieved. I wanted him to face real consequences," she said, "for what he tried to do to you, for what he tried to do with the lies about me." "He did face consequences," Matthew said. "He lost everything he had spent years trying to take from other people. That is a particular kind of justice." Grace nodded slowly. The evening light was in her hair, which she wore down sometimes now when the work of the day was done, and it fell across her shoulders in the warm amber of the sunset, and Matthew, looking at her, felt the same profound rightness he felt every time he allowed himself to simply look at her without the careful management of his own response. "I think," Grace said, in the deliberate way she had when she was saying something important, "I would like to plant more of the East Garden this fall. And I would like to put curtains in the upstairs rooms before winter." "All right," Matthew said. She turned to look at him. "And I think," she said, her voice quieter now, "that by spring we will need to think about which room to make into a nursery." The silence was the best kind. Matthew looked at her. She was watching him with those green-gray eyes and a calm that was full to the edges with something else, something uncertain beneath the surface, waiting for his response. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had on that July drive home from town, and held it the same way like something carefully precious. "A nursery," he said, "if you are." "Grace," he said, and his voice had that quality it had, the one that was below words, "there is nothing in this world I want more." Her face, when she smiled at him, was everything. The spring of 1884 came with longer days and the sound of water running full in the creek and the smell of the earth waking up, and in the third week of March, 1 year and 1 day after Grace Donnelly had first arrived in Cuesta Verde, a son was born at the Blackwell ranch. Matthew was there for every moment of it, which was not entirely common for the time and place, but he had refused to be elsewhere, and the midwife who came from Cuesta Verde had given him a look that suggested she found his presence both inconvenient and secretly admirable. The boy was healthy and loud, and came into the world with an opinion about it that was immediately apparent. Grace held him against her chest in the lamplight of the bedroom, and Matthew sat beside her on the bed, his hand against her hair, and looked at this small new person who was half Grace and half himself, and felt the ground of the world shift permanently into a new configuration. "What do we name him?" Grace asked. She was exhausted and radiant, which was a combination he had not known was possible until this moment. "Thomas," Matthew said, "for my grandfather who came west from Tennessee with nothing but a horse and a rifle and the kind of stubbornness that apparently runs in this family." Grace laughed, the whole face laugh, and then winced because laughing hurt, and then laughed again anyway. "Thomas Blackwell," she said, testing it. "Thomas Matthew Blackwell," Matthew said, "if that is all right." "It is more than all right," she said. Clara came in 10 minutes later and wept openly and held her nephew with a tenderness that was a complete undoing of every piece of armor she had ever worn. Samuel Park, who had been waiting downstairs since the early hours of the morning on the grounds that Clara could not be expected to wait alone, sent his congratulations up by way of Hector Ruiz, who was also in the house for reasons that were ostensibly practical and actually entirely emotional. The year that followed Thomas's birth was full in every direction. Matthew hired 2 more hands for the ranch, the expanded operation now requiring the help, and the financial situation, which had been tight for years, eased into something that was not abundance but was comfortable and growing. Grace organized the household with the same efficiency she brought to everything, which now included managing the accounts book that Matthew handed over to her after noticing she was doing the calculations in her head faster than he was doing them on paper, and which she handled with a steady capability that made him wonder, not for the first time, what she might have done with her life under different circumstances. "I would have been a teacher," she said one evening when he asked her this, Thomas asleep in the nursery upstairs and Clara at the Forsyth house in town for a gathering of the small social circle she had built for herself there. "I loved teaching. The position I had in St. Louis was an assistant position, but the teacher I worked under was generous and let me do much more than my title suggested. I was good at it." "You could teach here," Matthew said. She looked at him. "There is not a proper school closer than Cuesta Verde," he said, "and I have been thinking that some of the children on the neighboring ranches have a long ride for a schooling that is not always consistent. If we were to set up a space here—" "Matthew," she said. "The main room could be arranged," he said. 3 mornings a week, say. We have the books, you have the training." She was looking at him with something in her face that was deep and moved, not surprised exactly, because he had a way of noticing what she needed and finding a way to provide it that she had come to understand was simply how he loved, but moved nonetheless. "You would do that," she said. "Not a question." "I would do anything that makes you fully yourself," he said. "That is not negotiation, that is just the truth." The small school that Grace Donnelly Blackwell established in the main room of the ranch house 3 mornings a week became one of the most important things in that corner of the New Mexico territory for the next several years. It started with 4 children from neighboring ranches. By its 3rd year it had 9, and Grace had written to the Territorial Education Office requesting formal recognition, which she eventually received, and which led to a proper schoolhouse being built on the Blackwell land in 1887, a small frame building 20 yards from the ranch house, with windows on both sides for light and a proper blackboard and 23 students by the time the roof was on. But that was later. In 1884, it was 4 children and the main room and Grace teaching arithmetic and reading and history with a conviction and a patience that made Matthew, who occasionally stood in the doorway and watched, feel something that was beyond the ordinary range of words he had available. He had a word for it, of course. He had known the word since August of 1883, if not before. He said it to her regularly, because he had decided, after 5 years of not saying things that needed to be said, that he would not make that mistake again. The summer that Thomas learned to walk was the summer that Clara and Samuel Park announced their engagement, and the Blackwell house in August of 1885 was a place of considerable noise and joy, and the complicated logistics of a wedding being planned, which Grace managed with the same organized competence she brought to everything while maintaining, somehow, the quality that made all of it feel warm rather than merely efficient. Matthew watched her move through the preparations, through the house, through the life they had built together, and he thought about the evening she had arrived here with 1 carpet bag and a leaner seeds coming up in the kitchen garden, and the way Clara had looked at her with the cautious beginning of hope, and he thought about everything that had changed and everything that had stayed the same. One evening in September, after the wedding plans had been made and the guests had been invited, and the dress had been ordered from Santa Fe, Matthew found Clara in the kitchen making tea in the late-night quiet of the house. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table. She poured him a cup without being asked, which was something she had always done and which would always feel like home. "Are you happy?" he asked her. "Completely," she said, and she meant it. "Good," he said. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The house was quiet around them, Thomas asleep upstairs and Grace asleep beside the empty space where Matthew had been before he came down. "Papa," Clara said, and something in her voice made him look at her carefully. "She came here with nothing," she said. The words were slow and deliberate, each one chosen. "I said that to you, that night in the kitchen. I said it like it was a reason to doubt her. I said it like having nothing made her suspect. Clara, let me finish," she said quietly. "She came here with nothing, and she gave this house everything it was missing." She looked at him across the table, this daughter of his who was her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and her own complete self, and her expression was both a reckoning and a peace. "I was afraid. I thought she was a danger. I thought she had a hidden motive because I could not understand why anyone would give so much without wanting something in return. But that is just how she is. That is just who Grace is. She gives, and you are happy, and this house is full again." "Was wrong, and I have been wanting to say that to you for a long time." Matthew reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. "You were not wrong to be careful," he said. "You were protecting something that mattered." "I was protecting you," she said. "And Grace protected you," he said, "in her own way, from the moment she got here, you know that." Clara nodded, her eyes bright. "She is the best thing that has happened to this family," Clara said. "After Mama, and I think Mama would have liked her. I think Mama would have been glad." Matthew sat with that for a long moment. Alina, who had been gone for 7 years now, who lived in his memory and in Clara's eyes, and in the seeds that had grown in the kitchen garden and kept being planted every spring by different hands. "I think so too," he said. "I do." Clara and Samuel Park were married in November of 1885, in the same Cuesta Verde church where Matthew and Grace had stood 3 years before. Grace made the wedding cake and stayed up late the night before to finish the flower arrangements that Clara had asked for, and said everything. Clara wanted to hear about how she looked in her dress, and held Clara's hands before the ceremony and said, simply, "Your mother would have been so proud." Clara, who had been managing her composure admirably all morning, broke down completely at that, and Grace held her until she was ready. Samuel Park, who had now had a year to observe the Blackwell family at close range, told Matthew quietly before the ceremony that he was the luckiest man in the territory, to which Matthew, thinking of Grace, replied that Samuel might actually be the second luckiest. They lived after the wedding in the town of Cuesta Verde, where Samuel had his school and where a small house had been found. But they were at the ranch every Sunday, and Clara, who loved her father and loved Grace and loved her nephew Thomas with a ferocity that was its own particular thing, was a constant presence in the years that followed. Thomas Blackwell grew up on the ranch the way his grandfather had once imagined Matthew might grow up, in the open air of the New Mexico territory, with the mountains on the horizon and the smell of cattle and sage, with a mother who could teach him anything from arithmetic to the name of every plant that grew in the creek bottom, and a father who taught him to ride and to work, and to treat people the way you wanted to be treated. By the time Thomas was 4, the ranch had expanded its grazing operation and added a small orchard to the south of the house, Grace's idea, executed with Matthew's practical muscle and Hector Ruiz's grudging assistance. 6 apple trees and 3 peach trees that would not bear seriously for several years, but that Thomas regarded as personal property from the moment the first one went into the ground. In the spring of 1887, when Thomas was 3 and the new schoolhouse was going up 20 yards from the front door, Grace came to find Matthew in the barn one morning before breakfast, which she did not typically do, and the expression on her face was one he had learned to read very precisely. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He set down what he was carrying and crossed the barn in 4 steps and put his arms around her and stood there in the smell of hay and horses holding his wife who had come here with nothing and given him back his life. "Boy or girl, I do not care even slightly," he said into her hair. "Clara wants a girl," Grace said against his shoulder. "Clara wants everything," he said. Grace laughed. He held her tighter. The daughter arrived in December of 1887, during the first real snowfall of the winter, white and silent outside the ranch house windows while inside there was noise and lamplight, and the midwife's firm instructions and Matthew's hand in Grace's, and the sound, eventually, of a cry that was the best sound in the world. They named her Alina, for the woman who had built the garden and died too young, and whose seeds were still growing every spring in the ground outside the kitchen door. Clara, when she heard the name, wept again, but differently from the way she had wept before. These were tears that were entirely happy. Matthew held his daughter Alina for the first time on a December evening with snow on the ground, and the ranch house lit and warm, and Grace resting in the bedroom and Thomas asleep in his room, upstairs already exhausted by the excitement. And he stood by the bedroom window with this small, sleeping, entirely new person in his arms and looked out at the snow and the mountains dark against the winter sky and thought about everything that had brought him here. The dark past, the grief, the scar. The man he had been for 5 years after Alina died, going through the motions of living while something essential in him waited in suspension, unable to move. The March afternoon in 1882, when a stage had pulled into Cuesta Verde, and a woman with green-gray eyes and 1 carpet bag had stepped down into the dust and looked at this country like it was something she had already decided to survive. He thought about her hands in the kitchen garden, and the way she laughed, and the night of the thunderstorm and Robert Alderton driving away down the track, and the October wedding and Thomas's birth, and the schoolhouse, and 5 years of mornings that were worth waking up for in ways he had thought he might never have again. He thought about the night Clara had stood in the kitchen doorway and said what she said, and the words he had found for it, which were the truest thing he knew. She came here with nothing and gave this house everything it was missing. Grace appeared in the bedroom doorway then, wrapped in her robe, quieter on her feet than she should have been 2 hours after childbirth, and looked at him with Alina in his arms. "You should be sleeping," he said quietly. "I wanted to look at you with her," she said. He crossed to her and she leaned against him and looked down at the baby, who was making small sounds without waking. "Alina," Grace said softly, "do you think she would have minded?" "I think she would have been grateful," he said. that this is what her house became. Grace looked up at him. In the lamplight in the December night, with the snow outside and their son asleep upstairs, and Clara, who would be here in the morning with Samuel, and the whole life they had built surrounding them on every side, she looked at him with everything she was. "I love you," she said, because they said it, because they had both learned the cost of not saying things. "I know you do," he said, "and I love you. That is the whole of it." She smiled, and it was the whole-face smile, the one that still surprised her sometimes. He kissed her forehead and guided her back to bed, and stood at the window another moment with a leaner before laying her in the cradle beside the bed. The cradle he had made with his own hands from pine wood in September when they knew she was coming, sanded smooth and warm in the lamplight. He lay down beside Grace in the dark. She was already asleep. He listened to the snow and the baby's breathing and the distant sound of the cattle and the whole sleeping ranch around him. This land that had been just survival for so long and was now the fullest thing he knew. The years continued. The schoolhouse grew. Thomas went from 4 to 8 to 12, growing into a serious, kind-natured boy who had his mother's gray-green eyes and his father's quiet stubbornness, and a gift for mathematics that Grace recognized early and cultivated with a pride that was not entirely objective. Alina grew from a dark-eyed infant into a fierce and funny girl who had opinions about everything and expressed them without apology, which was entirely characteristic of both her parents and made Clara laugh, until she had tears in her eyes every time she witnessed it. The Blackwell Ranch became one of the more prosperous small operations in that part of the New Mexico Territory through the late 1880s and into the 1890s. Not because of any dramatic fortune or discovery, but because of steady, honest work and good decisions, and the quality of judgment that Grace brought to it and Matthew applied. Hector Ruiz was eventually made a full partner in the cattle end of things, which was long overdue, and which he accepted with a dignity that was entirely characteristic. Robert Alderton never came back to New Mexico. He returned to St. Louis and eventually married someone else and lived, by all accounts, a life that was probably not as happy as it could have been, because he never did understand the difference between owning something and loving it. Grace bore him no particular ill will. She had enough good things in her life to fill every hour of it. Matthew's face over the years became entirely his, scar and all, and Grace had touched that scar so many times with such matter-of-fact tenderness that it ceased to exist in his own self-perception as something marked or damaged. It was simply part of his face, and his face was the face of the man she loved, and that was the complete extent of its meaning. There was one more evening that needs to be told. It was the summer of 1892, and Thomas was 8 years old and Alina was 4. And Clara and Samuel were there for Sunday supper with their own 2 children, a boy named James who was 6 and a girl named Alina Grace who was 2, named for the 2 women who had shaped the Blackwell family into what it was. The supper was done, and the children were in the yard in the long summer evening light, running and shouting with that complete physical abandon of children who have nowhere to be and nothing to be afraid of. And the adults were on the porch with coffee, and the satisfaction of a good meal, and the accumulated warmth of years of good Sundays like this one. Clara was watching the children in the yard, and something about the angle of the light and the particular quality of the evening made her face go through something private and grateful, and she looked over at Grace, who was sitting beside Matthew with her hand resting on his arm in the easy way of people who have been in love for a long time and have let it become a natural gravity between them. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked Clara quietly. "I am thinking about a March evening in 1882, Clara said, when my father drove a woman home from Cuesta Verde in his wagon, and I was watching from the porch when they pulled up, and I saw the way she looked at this house, and I thought, that woman is going to change everything." She paused, and I was afraid of it. "And now?" Samuel asked. Clara looked at her father and at Grace, and at the yard full of running children, and at the ranch that was alive and warm and full in every direction. "Now," she said, "I am only grateful that some changes cannot be stopped." Grace, who had heard this, turned from her conversation with Matthew and caught Clara's eye across the porch. Something passed between them in that look that did not need words. The whole of it. The difficult beginning and the trust that had been built slowly, and the years of mornings in the kitchen and the garden and the schoolhouse and the Sunday suppers and the babies and the grief that had been processed and the life that had been built, all of it passing between these two women in a single look on a summer evening in 1892. "I am glad I answered that advertisement," Grace said. "I am glad Margaret Forsythe's niece showed up uninvited," Clara said. They both laughed, and Matthew, who had heard this, looked at his wife with an expression that Clara had first seen on his face one October morning in Cuesta Verde 4 years before, in a church with the mountains in the windows, and which had not changed or diminished in any way since then. Thomas came running up to the porch steps, breathless and sunburned, and demanded that his father come out and play, because Uncle Samuel had been playing and fathers were supposed to be better than uncles, and he was going to prove it. And Matthew, who was 44 years old and had not run in the yard with children in longer than he could remember, set down his coffee and stood up and went. Grace watched him go. This man she had come west to find without knowing she was looking for him. This scarred rancher who had stood in front of Harlan Cole without flinching, and handed her a cup of coffee in the dark before 5 in the morning, and held her hand on the drive home from town, and made a cradle from pine wood for a daughter they would name for the woman who had loved this land before Grace arrived. She watched him run across the yard with Thomas, his laugh carrying back to the porch, and she thought about the woman she had been in St. Louis with her one carpet bag and her ruined reputation, and her absolute determination to find a life worth living. She had found it. She had found it here in this house, with this man, in this high red country under these enormous stars. The evening deepened toward dark and the children were called in, and the lamps were lit, and the ranch house glowed warm against the New Mexico night, the same as it had glowed the first time Grace Donnelly had seen it in the March dusk of 1882, only fuller now, only more itself, only more entirely what it had always had the capacity to become. Matthew came to stand beside her at the kitchen door, the door where Alina's seeds had first come up and where new things grew every year, where the peach trees were heavy in season and the apple trees bent under their own weight and the air smelled of earth and sage and home. He put his arm around her. "Good day," he said. "The best kind," she said. The stars came out one by one above the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the same stars that had burned above this land for 1,000 years before any of them arrived, indifferent to human drama and human love alike. And the house below them was lit and warm and entirely full. And in it, a man and a woman who had both survived the worst things that had ever happened to them stood in a kitchen doorway at the end of a summer day, and were simply, completely, without reservation or held-back piece of themselves, glad to be alive and here and together. And that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.